Hi, I am so delighted and overjoyed to be with you ladies today, even though it's virtual and not in person. I wish it were in person. I wish I could see each one of you and just enjoy your fellowship again. And I know that all of you sort of feel the same way because you have been in virtual church for so many months and just meeting with other people via online. And honestly, we have much to be thankful for that we actually have this option of meeting online. And I'm so grateful. In the case of our family, it's been a real help to continue to correspond with people and for my husband to be able to keep up with the BJ and BC stuff. Anyway, we are looking forward to being back with you again, Lord willing, as soon as we're able to. Right now, the Philippines is closed to us. We can't get back in. But we'll just continue praying about that and see how the Lord leads. So if you would pray with us for that. Um, I wanted to share some passages with you about seeking the Lord. Because honestly, in a time of uncertainty like we have right now, in a time of fear, in a time of trouble, these are the times when we really need to not turn to other things for help, but turn to the Lord for help. And so the passage I would like to read to you right now at the beginning is Isaiah 31:1. And it says this: Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. And there is a temptation for all of us in a time of trouble or a time of uncertainty to seek help from outside sources instead of from the Lord. And what I'd like to talk about this morning is to just sort of share a testimony about how the Lord has worked in my heart and in the heart of my husband in times of uncertainty or challenge, and how He has led us to really try to seek the Lord even in those difficult times. And not to look to other things for help, not to look at our circumstances, but to really look to Him for counsel, for advice, and for help in challenging circumstances. As you know, 2020 is a very unusual year. And I remember at the beginning of the year, just looking forward into the year and thinking, wow, I really need 2020 vision for this year. So I know what the Lord wants me to do this year. And in retrospect, none of us could have guessed what 2020 would hold. And the circumstances of this year have just been so bizarre and so unusual that none of us would have been able to guess. It is truly turbulent times. But these circumstances, God knew from the very beginning. He knew at the beginning of the year what would happen this year. He knew every single one of these events and things that have occurred. He knew from the start. So God is in control and He is all knowing. And even though these times may take us by surprise, they never take God by surprise. So I want to start by sharing with you something that happened to my family many years ago in 2003. So about 17 years ago. At that time, my husband and I were, my husband was teaching at a college, a Bible college in Wisconsin, and just north of Chicago in Milwaukee. And we had one little baby, and we were praying to return to Asia as missionaries, but the Lord hadn't opened that door yet. And so my husband and I prayed about a summer mission work that we could do that summer. And as events unfolded, the Lord led us to accept uh, um, a job to do in Cambodia, working with a couple of different little churches, and then also teaching in like a kind of a Bible school for adults. And so my husband and I prayed about it and we decided to go. And this was again in 2003. And or maybe 2003. And so we planned to go, and then we realized that I was pregnant. We hadn't known that when we decided to go. So as we grew closer to the time for us to leave to go to Cambodia that summer, um, we were facing some really unusual circumstances because that year was the year when SARS, one of the first coronaviruses that we ever heard about, was marching across Asia and killing people. Really, it was a much more deadly disease than COVID has proven to be, although it impacted fewer people. And so shortly before we were supposed to go, just within a month of the time of leaving, I think just a couple of weeks, maybe even, I went to my husband and I told him, I said, I'm really kind of nervous about this. I'm fearful about going because, I'm pregnant. We have a 6-month-old. SARS is killing people all across Asia. And, what's going to happen to us? The circumstances are not good for this. And my husband was feeling the same way. And so he said, yeah, let's pray about this. Let's just talk to the Lord about it. We need a word from the Lord. And a few days later, he came to me after this devotional time and he said, honey, I want to share with you what the Lord shared with me during my devotional time today. And his devotions that morning had been from Genesis, and it was about the story of Isaac. And it was so applicable to our lives at that time. And I'd like to share the passage with you. And this is from Genesis 26, verses 1 to 7. And I'm just going to read these verses. If you have your Bible, please read along. There was a famine in the land, beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham, your father. Now this passage references the first famine, and in that famine, Abraham, Isaac's father, went down to Egypt. Because when all of the Holy Land was experiencing a famine, Egypt still had food, because Egypt had the Nile. And on both sides of the Nile, there was a strip of fertile land. So Egypt almost always had food, even in the time of a famine. And we know that because remember in the times of Joseph, there was a famine in the land, and they had to get food from Egypt. But God says to Isaac, do not go down to Egypt. And God goes on to say this, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Did Isaac obey God? Isaac obeyed God. And verse 6 says, so Isaac dwelt in Gerar. And Isaac trusted God enough to obey God. In a time of challenging circumstances, in a time of famine, where I have no doubt he was concerned about his family and his household and getting enough food for them, and yet Isaac trusted God enough to stay in the promised land, and trust God. And he trusted God enough to obey him. But the passage goes on and says this in verse 7. And the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now, ask yourself where Isaac learned to call his wife his sister. And he learned that from Abraham too, didn't he? So he learned the idea of going down to Egypt during a famine from Abraham. He learned the idea of calling his wife his sister from Abraham. Abraham was telling a partial truth when he said that, because Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. But Isaac was not telling the truth at all. And he learned a half-lie or a lie from his father. And I want us to remember this, because in times of uncertainty or challenges or challenging decisions, often we make decisions and we don't really think about how it's going to impact our children. But our decisions and the decisions we make, especially in challenging times, will impact the way our children act, when they face troubling times. And that's a good thing for us to remember as wives or mothers, that our decisions will impact our children's decisions in the future. Well, my husband came to me and he read this passage with me and he said, honey, I want you to notice something. I want you to notice that in verse 6, Isaac trusted God enough to obey God. But in verse 7, the Bible tells us that Isaac did not trust God for the consequences of his obedience. And Isaac, though he stayed in the land, did not trust God enough to trust him that the men would not kill him for his wife. And as my husband and I were making the decision whether or not to go to Cambodia and to take our tiny daughter, who was 6 months old at the time, and take his pregnant wife, myself, and go to a country which was very poor and very oppressed at that time. They were still recovering from the oppression of Pol Pot. And go to this country knowing that SARS is spreading rapidly throughout Asia, and knowing that we were sort of putting ourselves in danger of one sort or another. And my husband said to me, honey, we can trust God enough to obey him, and we can trust him for the consequences of obedience. And we went to Cambodia that summer knowing we didn't know what the consequences of our obedience would be. We might catch SARS, we might not. We didn't know what would happen. Our daughter might get sick. Our daughter might even get sick and die. And we didn't know, but we went praying and just trying to trust the Lord, not only to obey him, but for the consequences of that obedience. And you know what? The Lord brought us through that summer. We didn't get SARS at all. We did catch dengue fever, and that was miserable. I've never been so miserable in my life. We were sick for about 2 weeks, pretty seriously ill. And then for about 2 months, I was really not recovered. And it just took me a long time to regain my strength, probably partly because I was pregnant at the time. But you know what? That whole summer, our daughter did not get sick one time. She didn't catch SARS. She didn't catch dengue fever. She didn't get anything. The other little children she was playing with, she would pick up their sippy cups and drink out of them. They had pneumonia. They had runny noses. She didn't catch anything. She would eat dead bugs off the floor and never got sick, not one time. God protected the one who was so dear to us, the one that we were concerned about the most. God took good care of her. And that was so many years ago. That was 17 years ago. But as my husband and I faced an upcoming furlough this year at the beginning of 2020, and in March we were praying about, Lord, should we go back to the States or should we stay here? Because the numbers are rising in the States and traveling, it's not a good time to travel. With everything that's going around, it almost is certain that we'll catch COVID if we travel. And yet, as we prayed about it and we considered the fact that God had led us to plan that furlough 2 years before, and he had led us to schedule meetings and seminars and, marriage retreats and all kinds of things for our time here, and even a class my husband was supposed to teach at a seminary, all of that had been scheduled for well over a year in advance. And God had led us to schedule that. So we kind of came down to the idea that if God doesn't shut the door, we just need to follow what his leading was for us. And we need to trust him enough to obey him. And while we're doing that, we really need to trust him for the consequences of obedience. Because honestly, just looking at the state of the world, who knows what will happen? And it's even worse now. Once we got here, we realized that the United States is like has the number one most cases in the whole world. And not only that, we have rioting and all kinds of political unrest going on right now that we wouldn't have guessed at before we came. But as we looked at that, we just said, so many years ago when we were planning to go to Cambodia, and there was a different coronavirus going on at the time, God protected us. And we can trust him. He'll maybe protect us, maybe he won't. We can trust him for that either way. And we're just going to go, we're just going to do the will of God, and we're just going to trust him for the consequences. And that was what we chose to do. And honestly, part of our decision-making process is thinking about how are my decisions going to impact my children. And that is true whether we're thinking my decisions might impact my children by allowing them to get sick. But even greater than that is the idea that our decisions impact our children by impacting their future decisions in times of difficulty or trouble. And what I want for my children is I want them to be able to trust the Lord enough to obey him, no matter what their circumstances are, no matter what challenges they face. This world is not going to get any better. I think it's just going to continue to get worse. We may conquer this coronavirus. There will be another one in a few years. Every so many years, they say these huge diseases come and wipe out whole portions of the population. Well, that could just get worse. There's so many things. Political unrest in this world could get worse. Persecution of believers is getting worse all the time. These things are going to cause troublesome times in the future. And when it does, I want my children to be able to say, okay, I can trust God enough to obey him, and I can trust him for the consequences of that obedience, whether or not I face troubles because of it. When times are tough, we should not seek help from other sources. We must seek help from the Lord. Psalm 27 says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God." Psalm 60, verse 11 and 12 says this, "Give us help from trouble, for the help of man is useless. Through God we shall do valiantly, for it is he who shall tread down our enemies." And whether that enemy is an enemy army, or whether it's an army of microorganisms that infect our bodies, God is the one who protects us in times of trouble. We cannot trust our circumstances. We must trust our God, and we must seek his help. So Isaiah 30, verses 1 to 2, I'm going to read that to us too. And this is right before the other passage I read at the beginning. "Woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord, who take counsel, but not of me, and who devise plans, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who walk to go down to Egypt, and have not asked my advice, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt." And in this case, the Lord's people, were taking counsel but of other sources than God. They were devising plans, but those plans were not of his spirit. They were asking advice, but not from God. And they were strengthening themselves in the strength of Pharaoh and trusting in the shadow of Egypt, when they really needed to be trusting in the shadow of the Almighty. And God is the one who can strengthen us. And God is the one who will never let us down. And the next verse of this passage says, "Therefore the strength of Pharaoh shall be your shame, and trust in the shadow of Egypt shall be your humiliation." And I think even now, there are a lot of God's people who are maybe trusting in the wrong things. They're not leaning solely on him, and they're trusting maybe in the possibility of a future vaccine, or they're trusting in their government, or they're trusting in their quarantine, or they're trusting in their own actions. And there's so many things that we tend to rely on or trust in, when what we really need to be trusting in and relying on is God, not our news sources, not the status of the disease that's floating around the world, not our hospitals, not our vaccinations, not even our doctors. And we have many good doctors. We go to doctors, but we trust in the Lord. And I want us to really think about that at this time. The next chapter over is the verse I read at the beginning, chapter 31, and I want to read verses 1 to 5. "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel nor seek the Lord." And now I want you to hear the rest of this passage. Yet he, God, also is wise and will bring disaster, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of evildoers and against the help of those who work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. They all will perish together. In other words, if you're trusting on the wrong thing, and in doing so you are neglecting to trust in the Lord your God, watch out. Because when God stretches out his hand, your help will fall, and you will fall with it. For thus the Lord has spoken to me, verse 4. As a lion roars and a young lion over his prey, when a multitude of shepherds is summoned against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor be disturbed by their noise. So like a lion will not be deterred from his course of action just by a lot of noise made by shepherds. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight for Mount Zion and for its hill. Like birds flying about, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending, he will also deliver it. Passing over, he will preserve it. And these words, these verbs that are used to describe what the Lord of hosts does for Mount Zion, come down, fight for it, defending Jerusalem. Defending it, he will deliver it. Passing over, he will preserve it. Those are the kinds of verbs we want God doing for us these days, isn't it? Defending us, delivering us, preserving us. And yet God says that that's what he'll do because he is the Holy One of Israel, because he is the Holy One of me. He is my Holy One. He is my God. And he can do that for us. He is all powerful. Do we understand the meaning of that word, all powerful? It means that if he determines to do it, nothing can stand in his way. If he determines to wipe out this disease, nothing's going to stand in his way. And if he determines to let it continue, no vaccine is going to help it. No government is going to be able to stop it. God is all powerful. He allows trials like the ones we're facing right now, not to draw us further away from him, but to draw us closer to him. And in the midst of these trials, what he wants the most is for us to seek him and turn to him, not seek help from other sources. So my encouragement for us today is twofold. Number one, in times of uncertainty or trouble, turn to the Lord. You can trust him enough to obey him, and you can trust him for the consequences of that obedience. And maybe you will catch COVID and maybe you won't. And maybe you will die and maybe you won't. But God is able to keep you. And even if the worst possible things happen, even if as our family travels we get into a car accident on the road, or even if we all catch COVID, and by the way, we did get COVID and recovered just fine. In fact, we had very light symptoms. But even if that happens and we pass away, God is still our defender and our keeper, and he will deliver us into eternity. And we can trust God for these things. And when you are facing a decision, or when you are facing a challenging circumstance, I want to encourage you to think about Isaac. And I want to encourage you to think about Israel and about how God wanted them to lean on him. And we can do that.